June 14, 1944. 0200 hours. 6 kilometers southwest of Corentin, Normandy, France. Temperature 48 degrees Fahrenheit. No moon. Cloud cover total. Visibility estimated at 15 meters maximum in open ground, 3 meters inside hedgerow corridors. Wind east-northeast at 4 knots, carrying the smell of burned diesel and decomposing livestock from the shattered farmland beyond the American perimeter. Corporal Nobody Knows His Name now sat in a foxhole that smelled like wet earth and old fear, listening to the kind of silence that gets men killed. His squad occupied a hedgerow junction in Bocage country, the nightmare landscape of Normandy where every field became a fortress and every sunken lane a killing corridor. They had been holding this position for 11 days. In those 11 days, 4 men from his platoon had died without firing a shot. Throats opened in darkness. Sentries found at dawn with their weapons still slung, eyes wide, blood pooled black in the grass. The Germans owned the night here. They moved through hedgerows like shadows, patient and skilled, trained in infiltration tactics that turned American perimeters into sieves. Standard tripwire defenses had failed repeatedly. Tin cans filled with pebbles, the textbook method taught at every training camp from Georgia to Scotland, announced their presence so loudly that German scouts simply avoided them or cut the wires from safe angles, then slipped through gaps to murder sleeping soldiers. Battalion had tried everything. More sentries which only provided more targets. Illumination flares, which revealed American positions while Germans melted into shadow. Aggressive patrol activity, which exhausted men needed for daytime operations and resulted in friendly fire incidents in the impenetrable darkness. Nothing worked. The nightly infiltrations continued. Morale hemorrhaged with each dawn discovery of another dead American, killed silently by enemies who seemed to see in the dark. Our corporal had arrived in Normandy with the 4th wave, 3 days after D-Day, part of a replacement shipment feeding fresh meat into divisions chewed apart on Omaha and Utah beaches. He came from Montana, from high plains country where horizons stretched forever and a man could see trouble coming from miles away. He had grown up with horses, breaking colts on his family's ranch, learning the language of animals and the patience required to earn their trust. He enlisted 2 months after Pearl Harbor, expecting to join cavalry units, still believing horses had a place in modern war. The Army had different ideas. By 1943, the cavalry had mostly vanished from combat roles, replaced by tanks and mechanized infantry. They trained him at Fort Benning as a rifleman, taught him to dig foxholes instead of curry horses, to carry a garand instead of a saber. But they couldn't train away his instincts. He still moved quietly, still observed terrain with a horseman's eye for routes and obstacles, still understood systems of alarm that didn't rely on human vigilance. Before the war, he had spent countless nights in high country pastures watching over horse herds during foaling season. Predators came in darkness. Wolves, mountain lions, coyotes emboldened by hunger. A sleeping man couldn't guard effectively. So ranchers used systems. Dogs helped, but dogs could be distracted or poisoned. The most reliable method involved stringing wire at strategic approaches, fitted with small bells or metal rings that clinked when disturbed. Not loud enough to panic the herd, but distinct enough to wake a drowsing cowboy. Bridle rings specifically had proven ideal. Small steel loops, perhaps an inch in diameter, designed to attach reins to bits. When hung loosely on wire, they produced a subtle metallic chime if moved, a sound that blended with natural nighttime audio but registered as wrong to an experienced ear. Wolves crossing a wire would trigger the rings and pause, confused by the unexpected sound. That hesitation gave the rancher time to grab his rifle. The system worked because it didn't scream alarm. It whispered wrongness. Now, sitting in French mud half a world from Montana, the corporal considered the same problem. Standard tripwires used tin cans because they were abundant and loud. But loud was the problem. A can full of stones crashing in the night announced danger so obviously that any competent infiltrator simply avoided the noise or cut the wire and moved on. What if the alarm could be subtle instead? A sound that registered as potentially natural, that might cause an enemy patrol to pause but not flee, to investigate cautiously rather than abort their mission? He had found the bridle rings in a burned-out stable 2 kilometers back, part of a French farm annihilated by artillery. The building had collapsed into rubble, but the tack room remained partially intact. Amid shattered wood and scorched leather, he discovered a collection of brass and steel tack hardware, buckles, rings, small bells meant for draft horses. He pocketed a dozen bridle rings, each about the size of a silver dollar, made of steel that wouldn't rust easily. Part 2, words 1001 to 2000. The first time he proposed the idea, his squad leader, a sergeant from Philadelphia who had survived North Africa and Sicily, rejected it outright. They were using regulation methods, the sergeant explained with the weary patience of a man who had watched too many clever ideas get soldiers killed. Tin cans worked fine if positioned correctly. The problem wasn't the system, it was execution. Sentries needed to stay awake. Tripwires needed proper placement. Discipline was the answer, not cowboy innovation from some ranch hand who probably still dreamed about horses. The corporal didn't argue. He had learned in the army that arguing with sergeants was like arguing with weather, pointless and likely to make your situation worse. But he also knew what he knew. Tin cans weren't working. Men were dying. And doctrine written in training manuals by officers who slept in chateaus 20 kilometers behind the lines didn't account for the specific nightmare of bocage warfare, where German infiltrators moved through vegetation so thick that visibility dropped to arm's length. So he rigged his own foxhole position with bridle rings. He strung a wire 20 meters out, along a natural approach through a gap in the hedgerow. Instead of cans, he threaded 6 rings onto the wire, spacing them unevenly so any disturbance would cause multiple contacts, multiple small chimes. He tested the system carefully. A boot pressing the wire produced a soft metallic tinkle, like wind chimes heard from inside a house. Not loud. Not obviously man-made. But distinct, especially to an ear trained to hear it. 3 nights later the system worked. 0300 hours, absolute darkness. The corporal dozing in his foxhole with his rifle across his knees. The soft chime reached him through layers of exhausted sleep, a gentle metallic whisper that didn't belong. His eyes opened. He didn't move, didn't make sound. He listened. 10 seconds later, another chime, slightly different pitch. Something was moving along his tripwire. Something careful and deliberate. He woke his foxhole partner, a replacement from Ohio who had arrived 4 days earlier and still flinched at distant artillery. The corporal whispered instructions. Safety off, watch the approach, fire only on his command. They waited. The metallic sounds continued, sporadic and quiet. The corporal's mind built a picture from audio alone. Someone moving very slowly through the gap, probably crawling, definitely cautious. The bridle rings weren't screaming alarm. They were whispering presence. 5 minutes of glacial tension. Then movement resolved into shape. A figure low to the ground, barely visible even at 10 meters. German uniform. Rifle held forward. The infiltrator had heard the rings but misidentified them as natural sounds, perhaps metal debris shifted by a foraging animal. He continued forward, focused on reaching the American foxholes beyond. The corporal let him come. 7 meters. 5 meters. Close enough to see the man's face, pale in darkness, young and frightened and trying to be brave. The corporal fired once. The Garen's report shattered the night. The German dropped without sound. Within seconds the entire perimeter erupted. Rifles firing, men shouting, flares climbing into the sky. But the infiltration had been stopped before it reached the foxholes, before knives found sleeping throats. Dawn revealed the kill. One German soldier, 19 years old according to papers in his pocket, carrying a trench knife and 3 stick grenades. A scout, part of a larger patrol that had aborted when they heard gunfire. The corporal's warning system had worked perfectly. The soft alarm had allowed controlled response instead of panic, had stopped infiltration at the perimeter instead of inside the defensive line. His squad leader noticed. The sergeant examined the bridle ring setup with the careful attention of a man who survived by learning from what worked. He asked questions. How many rings? What spacing? How did the corporal distinguish between animal movement and human? The corporal explained his thinking. Animals moved erratically, triggered rings in random patterns. Humans, even careful humans, moved with rhythm and purpose. The sound pattern told the story. The sergeant implemented the system across the entire squad that same day. They scrounged more rings from abandoned farms, repurposed curtain hardware and harness fittings, anything small and metal that would chime softly when disturbed. By nightfall, 6 positions had been rigged with the modified alarms. The sergeant reported the innovation to the platoon leader, a young lieutenant from Virginia who had earned his commission 3 months earlier at officer candidate school and approached war with the rigid certainty of the recently educated. The lieutenant inspected the setup and immediately ordered its removal. His reasoning was doctrinal and absolute. Tripwire alarms must provide unmistakable warning. Subtlety was dangerous. A sentry might sleep through soft sounds or mistake them for natural noise, allowing infiltrators to penetrate the line. Regulation methods existed for good reasons, developed through years of military experience and combat testing. Improvised systems introduced unpredictability, which meant risk, which meant dead Americans. The bridle rings came down. Tin cans went back up. That night, 2 more men died. Different platoon, different section of perimeter, same method. Silent infiltration, throats cut, bodies discovered at first light. The regiment's nightly casualties had become routine, expected, absorbed into the arithmetic of attrition that governed bocage warfare. Officers filed reports. Chaplains wrote letters to families. Replacements arrived to fill the gaps. The war ground forward, measuring progress in meters and corpses. Part 3, Words 2001 to 3000. Our corporal watched this happen and made a decision that could have gotten him court-martialed. He rigged his position with bridle rings again, concealing them carefully so casual inspection wouldn't reveal the violation. His foxhole partner, the replacement from Ohio, said nothing. The kid had been in combat long enough now to understand that survival mattered more than regulations, that officers 20 meters away couldn't protect you from knives in darkness. The squad leader knew. The sergeant saw the rings go back up and turned away without comment, granting permission through deliberate ignorance. He was a practical man who measured systems by results rather than doctrine. If the corporal wanted to use unauthorized methods to protect his own position, that was a risk the sergeant was willing to tolerate quietly. But he couldn't officially endorse it. His career and authority depended on maintaining the appearance of regulatory compliance. For 8 more nights nothing happened. The corporal's sector remained quiet while other sections of the perimeter continued suffering infiltration casualties. He began to wonder if he had imagined the system's effectiveness, if the first success had been luck rather than innovation. Maybe the lieutenant was right. Maybe subtle alarms were just invitations for disaster, and he was gambling with his life on nostalgia for Montana pastures that had nothing to do with French killing grounds. June 22nd. 0130 hours. Temperature dropping toward 40 degrees under clear skies that finally allowed starlight. The cloud cover that had persisted since D-Day had broken, providing the first decent visibility in weeks. German commanders noticed. Infiltration patrols increased, taking advantage of improved conditions to probe American lines more aggressively. At 0145, the corporal heard his rings sing. Not a single chime but a sequence, soft metallic whispers spaced 3 seconds apart, suggesting careful movement along the wire. He came fully awake, adrenaline hitting his bloodstream like ice water. He touched his partner's shoulder, one finger to lips for silence. Both men brought rifles to ready position, safeties off, eyes straining toward the dark gap in the hedgerow where the tripwire was positioned. The chiming continued. Sporadic, quiet but definitely there. The corporal counted intervals, building a mental picture. Multiple contacts suggested either a very clumsy animal or multiple individuals moving in sequence. His gut said human. His training said wait. Don't fire prematurely. Identify the threat. Confirm target. 60 seconds became 90. The metallic whispers stopped. Silence returned, thick and dangerous. Had they heard the rings and retreated? Or had they crossed the wire and now moved between the alarm and the foxholes, closing distance in the darkness? The corporal's hands tightened on his garand. His partner's breathing had gone shallow and fast, the sound of controlled terror. Then voices, German, low and urgent, maybe 25 meters out. Not whispers but quiet conversation, the tone suggesting confusion rather than alarm. The corporal's mind raced through implications. They had definitely crossed his wire. They had heard the rings but hadn't recognized them as alarm, had written off the sound as environmental noise. And now they were discussing something, probably trying to orient themselves in the hedgerow maze, trying to determine which direction held the American foxholes. The corporal made a decision that violated every standard tactical doctrine. Instead of firing immediately to eliminate the threat, he remained silent. If this was a patrol rather than individual infiltrators, killing 1 or 2 would send the rest scattering back through gaps in the perimeter, escaping to report American positions and strength. But if he waited, if he let them commit fully to their approach, he might capture or kill the entire group. He hand-signaled his partner, hold fire, wait, be patient. The kid's eyes were wide enough to catch starlight, terror and trust mixing in equal measure. The corporal shifted position slightly, angling to get a better view of the approach corridor. Movement resolved gradually, multiple figures low to the ground, advancing in tactical formation. Professional. Disciplined. This wasn't a random infiltration, this was a reconnaissance patrol with specific mission objectives. The corporal counted shapes. At least 5, possibly 6. Too many to engage alone without support. He needed to wake adjacent positions, Needed to establish a proper ambush before this patrol reached the perimeter. But any sound would alert them. Any movement might trigger their own alarms. He was trapped between action and paralysis, watching enemies creep closer while calculating impossible odds. The German voices came again, closer now, perhaps 15 meters. One voice held authority, an officer or senior NCO giving quiet orders. The patrol had stopped advancing. They were discussing something, possibly debating whether to proceed or withdraw. The corporal caught fragments of German, words he half understood from intelligence briefings. Amerikaner. Drahtzahn, something about wire and positions. They had found his perimeter wire. Not the tripwire with bridle rings, but the actual defensive wire strung along the hedgerow base. They were studying it, trying to determine if it was defended or abandoned, whether cutting through would trigger response. This was the moment. If they decided to withdraw, the opportunity would evaporate. If they decided to advance and cut wire, they would make noise that would wake other positions anyway. The corporal made his choice. He pulled a fragmentation grenade from his belt, straightened carefully in his foxhole, estimated trajectory in darkness, and threw hard toward the German voices. The grenade's flight made a soft rushing sound. Someone shouted in German, alarm, recognition, terror compressed into a single syllable. Then detonation, a sharp crack that strobed the hedgerow white for a fraction of a second, revealing 6 men in Feldgrau uniforms frozen in snapshot clarity. Part 4, words 30:01 to 40:00. The corporal was firing before the light faded, working his Garand's trigger as fast as accuracy allowed, 8 rounds of 30-06 punching into the space where Germans had been visible a heartbeat before. His partner joined him, rifle barking in rapid semi-automatic cadence. Adjacent foxholes woke to chaos and added their fire, tracers lancing through darkness and flat trajectories that intersected at the killing ground. The fight lasted 90 seconds. German return fire came sporadically, disorganized, the response of men surprised and wounded trying to extract themselves from disaster. One enemy automatic weapon opened up, a Sturmgewehr 44, distinctive in its cyclic rate, firing blind into the American perimeter, bullets cracking overhead and thudding into earth berms. The corporal dropped below his foxhole rim, changed magazines, came back up firing at the muzzle flash. The enemy weapon went silent. Then voices in darkness, shouting in German. Not combat orders but surrender phrases, hands-up declarations that needed no translation. Nicht schießen. Don't shoot. The firing stopped raggedly as Americans recognized the words, held fire, waited for confirmation. The platoon leader's voice cut through the silence, ordering ceasefire, demanding situation report. Prisoners, the corporal shouted back. Multiple prisoners requesting illumination. A flare climbed skyward from a launcher 50 meters away, burst white overhead, brought the scene into harsh magnesium clarity. 6 German soldiers, 3 standing with hands raised, 2 prone and wounded but alive, 1 motionless in a way that suggested death. Weapons scattered on the ground. No fight left in them. The Americans secured the prisoners quickly, efficiently, months of training and weeks of combat teaching them the choreography. Hands searched for hidden weapons, removed grenades and ammunition, zip-tied wrists behind backs. Medics moved to the wounded Germans with the same professional detachment they brought to American casualties. Assessed, stabilized, tagged for evacuation. The dead German received a cursory check for intelligence materials before being dragged clear. Dawn brought revelation. The captured patrol included an Oberleutnant, a first lieutenant, carrying a leather document case that shouldn't have been on a reconnaissance mission. The regimental intelligence officer arrived by jeep at 0700 hours, examined the documents, and disappeared back toward headquarters without explanation. Within 2 hours, the corporal's company commander appeared, a captain from New York who rarely visited frontline positions. The captain wanted details. How had the corporal detected the patrol? What had alerted him before they reached the perimeter? The corporal explained the bridle ring system, demonstrated the subtle sound, walked the captain through his reasoning. The officer listened without interruption, asked technical questions about positioning and detection ranges, examined the improvised alarm with careful attention. You were ordered to remove this system, the captain observed, statement rather than question. Yes, sir, the corporal replied, offering no excuse or justification. The captain nodded slowly, thinking through implications. The Oberleutnant was carrying operational plans for a division-level attack, he said quietly. Operation Nordwind. 15th of July, 3 weeks from now. 25,000 German troops attacking south through Alsace, trying to split our line and reach the Mediterranean coast. They've been planning this for 6 weeks. The captain paused, letting the weight of that information settle. Your unauthorized alarm system captured the officer before he could report back. German High Command thinks this patrol is still gathering intelligence. They don't know we have their plans. Because you violated a direct order and rigged a system your platoon leader had forbidden, we now have 2 weeks to prepare defenses and reposition forces. Preliminary staff estimates suggest we'll prevent 15,000 American casualties. The corporal said nothing. There was nothing to say. The math was simple and horrifying. His small defiance had purchased the lives of 15,000 men he would never meet, soldiers who would survive battles that would now never happen because the ambush had been anticipated and countered. It made his brain hurt to consider the cascading implications. I'm not going to court-martial you, the captain continued, but I'm also not going to officially authorize your system. It violates standing operating procedures, and if I endorse it and someone dies because they didn't hear the alarm, their death becomes my responsibility. However, I'm also not going to order its removal again. What individual squad leaders and soldiers do to protect their specific positions, using their own initiative and accepting their own risk, is between them and their conscience. It was bureaucratic poetry, permission granted through official refusal to notice. The captain left, taking his legal deniability with him. But word spread through the regiment anyway, the way news always spread among combat soldiers, through whispered conversations and observed results. Other squads started rigging bridle ring alarms. Supply. Sergeants mysteriously acquired metal hardware from civilian sources. Within a week, half the regiment's perimeter positions employed the quiet chiming system. German infiltration casualties dropped to nearly zero. The nightly throat-cutting stopped. Enemy reconnaissance patrols found themselves walking into ambushes, captured or killed before reaching American positions. The Germans adapted, began avoiding hedgerow approaches entirely, shifted to long-range observation instead. The tactical balance shifted because one cowboy corporal remembered how his grandfather protected horse herds from wolves. Operation Nordwind never happened. German units earmarked for the offensive were redeployed to counter Russian advances in the east. The Alsace attack plan was quietly shelved, its secrecy compromised by the captured documents, its surprise advantage eliminated. Historians would later note the operation's cancellation in footnotes, attributing it to strategic considerations and changing theater priorities. None would know about bridle rings on French tripwires. The corporal survived the war. He fought through France into Germany, participated in the crossing of the Rhine, saw the concentration camps that explained in visceral horror why the war had been necessary. He took shrapnel in his left leg near Mannheim in March 1945, spent 6 weeks in a hospital in England, then shipped home in July after Germany's surrender, carrying a Purple Heart and a combat infantryman badge and memories that would wake him sweating for the next 40 years. Part 5, words 4001 to 5000. He returned to Montana. The ranch was smaller than he remembered, diminished by years of absence and the terrible education of combat. His father was older, worn by the double burden of working the land alone and waiting for telegrams that might announce his son's death. His mother cried when she saw him limping off the bus in town, cried harder when he couldn't explain what had happened to make him so different from the boy who had left. He didn't talk about the war. The people in town asked questions with the earnest curiosity of those who had experienced conflict only through newsreels and radio broadcasts, who imagined war as adventure rather than endless terror punctuated by boredom. He gave them the answers they wanted. Yes, the Germans fought hard. Yes, France was beautiful. Yes, he was glad to be home. He didn't mention the smell of burned flesh or the sound men made when they died badly or the weight of knowing his small cleverness had purchased thousands of lives while changing nothing about the fundamental horror. He married a local girl in 1947, the daughter of a neighboring rancher who understood silence and didn't press him for stories. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. He taught his son to break horses the old way, with patience and respect rather than violence. He strung wire around his pastures and hung small bells on sections where predators might approach. The sound reminded him of things he couldn't discuss, but also of the fact that he had survived when so many hadn't. The Army never officially recognized the bridle ring innovation. No medals were issued for violating orders, even when those violations saved thousands of lives. The tactical technique didn't make it into training manuals or doctrinal publications. It remained an improvised field expedient, passed soldier to soldier through the oral tradition of combat units, used and adapted and eventually forgotten as the men who knew its story aged and died. In 1978, A military historian researching unconventional tactics in the European theater found references to the system in several unit after-action reports. He tracked down veterans, conducted interviews, tried to piece together the origin story. Several men remembered using bridle rings or similar improvised alarms. None could remember who had invented the technique. The trail led to a Montana ranch, to an aging veteran who deflected questions and said he didn't remember much about the war, that it had been a long time ago and his memory wasn't what it used to be. The historian wrote a brief paragraph in his book, noting the anonymous innovation and its tactical effectiveness. The book sold poorly, read mostly by military professionals and serious amateur historians. The paragraph about bridle rings occupied 7 lines on page 234, wedged between discussions of more dramatic innovations like shaped charges and proximity fuses. No names were mentioned. The technique was attributed to forward-deployed personnel demonstrating tactical flexibility under combat conditions. Our corporal died in 1994, a month before the 50th anniversary of D-Day, when news coverage flooded with nostalgic retrospectives about the greatest generation and their war. He was 71 years old. Heart failure, quick and relatively painless. His funeral was well attended by local ranchers and veterans from the County American Legion post. The minister spoke about duty and sacrifice. An honor guard fired a rifle salute. A bugler played taps slightly off-key. His wife accepted a folded flag. In his personal effects, his children found a small wooden box containing a single steel ring, slightly larger than a silver dollar, with a worn brass pin attached that might have once connected it to leather straps. None of them knew what it was or why he had kept it. They added it to the collection of military memorabilia donated to the County Historical Society. A uniform, some medals, photographs of young men in fatigues who all looked impossibly young and serious. The ring was labeled unidentified hardware, and placed in storage where it remains today, its significance lost to time. But the technique survived in fragments. Special operations units in Vietnam experimented with similar systems, stringing fishing line with small bells in jungle terrain where conventional alarms were impractical. British forces in Northern Ireland used modified versions during the Troubles. American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan rediscovered the principle independently, rigging entry points with subtle alarms that didn't announce their presence to observers. Each time, the innovation was treated as novel, its lineage unknown, its origin forgotten. That is how war works. Soldiers in desperate circumstances invent solutions, test them against the ultimate measure of survival, pass them forward to others facing similar problems. Most innovations die with their inventors. A few survive in institutional memory, codified in manuals and doctrine. The rest live in the liminal space between used, effective, but never officially recognized, carried forward by whispered instruction and field observation until the specific context that made them necessary changes and they fade into historical footnote. The corporal never knew that his defiance had been theoretically vindicated. In the 2 decades after the war, military psychologists and tactical researchers conducted extensive studies on alarm systems and human response patterns. They discovered what he had understood instinctively. Obvious alarms trigger avoidance behavior, while subtle anomalies trigger investigation responses. An enemy who hears a loud alarm knows they have been detected and withdraws. An enemy who hears an ambiguous sound moves forward to investigate, voluntarily entering the kill zone. Modern military doctrine now includes graduated alarm systems, subtle initial warnings for ambush scenarios, obvious loud alarms for perimeter defense. The principle has been formalized, studied, optimized through decades of research and testing. But it started with one corporal who remembered how his grandfather protected horses from wolves, who violated orders because doctrine didn't match reality, who rigged bridle rings on wire and changed the tactical equation for thousands of soldiers who never knew his name. Part 6. Words 5001 to 5592. The German prisoners from that June night had their own stories. The Oberleutnant who carried the Nordwind plans survived the war in a prisoner camp in Mississippi, working on a cotton plantation and learning English from guards who treated captured Germans with bemused tolerance. He returned to Germany in 1947, became a high school teacher in Bavaria, never spoke publicly about his capture or the intelligence failure it represented. He died in 1981, the secret intact. 2 of the enlisted prisoners from that patrol settled in America after the war, using occupation program provisions that allowed former enemies to immigrate. One opened a restaurant in Cincinnati. The other became an electrician in Chicago. Both occasionally mentioned in bars that they had been captured by Americans in France, but neither remembered the specific details of that night clearly. Memory fades. Pain dulls. The sharp edges of trauma smooth with time and distance until only vague impressions remain. The hedgerow where it happened still exists. French farmers reclaimed the land after the war, filled in foxholes, removed wire, plowed under the detritus of combat. Wheat grows there now. Tourists driving through Normandy pass within 100 meters without knowing that 60 meters of fence line once held an improvised alarm system that changed the trajectory of a campaign and saved thousands of lives through pure battlefield ingenuity. There is no monument. No historical marker explains what happened. The location isn't included in battlefield tour itineraries. It was too small, too tactical, too individual to merit commemoration in a war that measured significance by divisions and army groups and strategic objectives. History remembers D-Day and the Bulge and the Rhine crossing. It forgets 10,000 small moments of innovation that collectively made those large victories possible. But on quiet nights in June, if you stand in that spot where French wheat now grows over American foxholes, you can almost hear the ghost of metallic chimes, soft enough to blend with wind through hedgerows, distinct enough to alert a careful ear. You can imagine young men crouching in darkness, listening to sounds that meant life or death, making split-second decisions that rippled forward through time to affect thousands of people who would never know their names. That is the corporal's real monument. Not bronze or stone, not official recognition or historical marker, but the accumulated survival of all the men who didn't die in battles that never happened. 15,000 American soldiers who came home to wives and children and careers, who grew old and complained about taxes and watched football on television and never knew they owed their existence to one defiant cowboy who strung bridle rings on wire in violation of direct orders. War is decided by men who move divisions on maps, who calculate logistics and strategy and grand operational objectives. But war is won by individual soldiers who improvise solutions to immediate problems, who trust their instincts over doctrine, who risk court-martial to implement methods that make tactical sense even when they violate regulations. The gap between official military theory and battlefield reality is where innovation happens, where survival depends on the willingness to reject approved methods in favor of what actually works. The corporal understood this without being able to articulate it. He never wrote about his experience, never tried to claim credit for his innovation, never sought recognition for the lives his defiance had saved. He simply went home, married his girl, raised his children, and died quietly in a Montana ranch house with a single steel ring stored in a wooden box as the only evidence that he had once changed the course of a war through sheer stubborn practicality. And perhaps that is the truest memorial any soldier could want. Not fame or decoration, but the knowledge that his actions mattered, that his small rebellion against stupidity had purchased survival for thousands of strangers, that he had seen a problem and solved it despite official disapproval, and that somewhere in the accumulated chain of human existence, families existed who would not have existed if he had followed orders instead of his instincts. The bridle rings are forgotten now. The technique has been reinvented and refined and incorporated into modern doctrine without attribution. The corporal's name is lost to history. But on certain nights, when the wind is right and memory is strong, you can still hear them, soft metallic whispers in the darkness, the sound of defiance that saved 15,000 lives and asked for nothing in return except the chance to go home and break horses in Montana sunshine, which is all any soldier ever really wanted anyway.